Alright, so I'm just going to get straight into it. First, I was compelled to preload this surface with masking tape. Then after a few camera adjustments, I could manoeuvre the table base into an optimal position. Then I used melamine tape to capture the exact length of the curved edges. That length will then be transferred to the aluminium right angle I'll be using to fix in place what I intend to be evenly distributed timber cladding. When working within certain parameters, in this case the table legs of those parameters, first I have to acknowledge the importance of the legs. For this project, the role of the table legs are twofold. Not only do they bear the weight of the table, they also dictate the size and distribution of said components between them. In order to generate the perfect size for individual components, there's a few precautionary measures I take. In most cases, especially when curved surfaces are involved, such as this project, it doesn't matter how good my calculations may be, being the flawed individual I am, I can most definitely get it wrong. To counter this flaw and to ensure I'm not about to create a pile of unusable, incorrectly sized firewood, for this project, I made a couple of simulated sections of cladding and set them all out at scale. Then I took a few more measurements, made the appropriate corrections and set up the workshop to take on a small-scale machining event. Because this particular task required a minimised portion of attention, it's my belief that this attention deficit left my mind open. That's when and why I believe I was struck with another design element. It was this thought that momentarily threatened to derail the almost relentless motion of the timber machining miniature freight train I was piloting. This additional idea required the cladded surface to be more than just a facade. It must maintain its composure and integrity even when I cut and remove large portions of it. So I retooled my router table and applied a groove to both sides of each individual section. Then I made timber tongues to lay within said grooves to bridge the small gap and sequentially interlock them with multiple parallel components. So if all goes according to plan, this will result in forming a curved set of formidable walls that can take 6 targeted direct hits, leaving gaping caverns to be filled with light. Then the light will be covered with an opal membrane, capturing and diffusing emitting light waves as they are dispersed between spaces that exist amongst timber webbing, where the full composition of individual parts work in unison to constrain a potential overload of light leakage. Once the small-scale machining event concluded, I confirmed the fit of the components and set them aside to make space for other projects. However, when I made this decision, I was completely ignorant of how long the cladding would lay dormant against a side wall in my workshop. From time to time, that pile may even appear in the background of some of my earlier videos. It ended up being almost 2 years before the hiatus ended, but I knew I'd get back to it. Since then, I've had some moments to successfully interact with several thoughts. Thoughts engaged in rigorous debate to determine the trajectory of the project. But I had to act quickly before I went too far and blocked all access to the table's innards. So I deconstructed what I'd made of the base and began removing timber. Even though this project had been put on hold, it remained very much on the radar. The pause gave me ample time to contemplate my next several moves whilst also finalising the design. It was a good thing too, because at some point I was hit the vision of integrating a themed lighting system into the table, so I set out to do just that. Unsure of exactly how I would run wires through the base, I chose to create as many access holes as possible while maintaining the integrity of the overall structure. But first, I had to get power to the base. I achieved this by placing a recessed power port on the table's underbelly. I knew this was a questionable move, so I set out to create what I thought to be the most robust solution to isolate all the hardware required to light the future dining event. Well, that was my intention. For now, I'm going to generate multiple access ports.
Move. Focus.
Now that I've perforated the timber components, I can move to the next ergonomic phase of the procedure, the process of easing the hole's sharp edges to allow smooth access to all wiring as it slithers its way through the belly of this beast. One of my biggest concerns when it came to electrifying the table was moisture. By that I mean accidental beverage spillages. In order to put my mind at ease, I preempted future concerns and attacked the issue of making it watertight head-on. So I housed all electrical components under the table and isolated them as much as possible. Now when I said it'll be watertight, I didn't mean it'll withstand being fully submerged in liquid, but it will be enough to set my mind at ease. A fair amount of consideration was given to all electrical hardware that was to be installed into the table's base. Heat also played a role in determining how and where I located electrical hardware. In this case, I mounted the power adapter under the base. The idea was to leave it outside and exposed. It's my belief that this exposure will help to mitigate heat that may otherwise build up if the adapter was housed inside the carcass of the base. After what turned out to be a fairly involved procedure, my method to achieve this exposure will gradually reveal itself. Eventually I made two separate receptacles to house plugs and wiring. Although the two essential housings are separated, they ended up with a special timber conduit connection between them. Anyway, I think it's time for me to shut my mouth and try to remain muted until this portion of the build concludes. However, I may inject some informative narration from time to time, or not. I know I could have done this on the lathe, but this seemed safer. During this build, I knew that at some point along the way I'd have to deal with a tough issue. Separation can be a difficult situation to deal with, but it's important to adapt and overcome.
Focus.
Now, staying within the theme of triumphant adaptation, at first what I'm about to do may appear as a repeat of the scenes that preceded this one, but I can assure you it's different. Although the components shared similarities, These parts demanded compensation for my impatient, misguided removal of material. My impatience led me to create an arched opening where these parts are to be placed. When I made this opening, I actually removed what would have otherwise been an excellent platform for the router equipment to locate its central pivot point. So I developed an alternative method to achieve a similar result. If I'd planned this better, I'd have ample material for the router jig's point to touch down, and all this filling would have been unnecessary. Fortunately, I successfully compensated for my mistake. Now the router can harness this success and generate a penetrating circular motion, hollowing out what will be a power plug connector receptacle. So all this time, the section of oak in the middle of the solid cylinder has been a placeholder that represents temporary central pivot point compensation. And now that compensation is no longer required. As I mentioned earlier, for this idea to operate as planned, I require a conduit for wiring to travel between power port receptacles. So now I'm going to make that special connection happen. After this adaptation, I can move on with the project because there's still a lot of ground to cover. When it's time to wire up this rig and to ensure it's a pleasant experience, it's important to process the area. As you can see, this process involves smoothing out and rounding over any threatening obstacles. The aim of this process is to reduce the chances of wiring, or anything else for that matter, getting caught up in the moment the wiring connection is made. One of the things I enjoy about the projects I make is the chance to create a problem, then solve it. So when I use some off-the-shelf parts, there's always the opportunity to customize and manipulate those standard parts to suit my needs.
Focus.
Okay, so now I've successfully fitted the power adapter. What comes next is perhaps overkill, but once again it certainly proved itself to be fertile ground for adaptation and discovery. Looking back at this footage now, I can't help but think that this is a document of my descent into madness. However, at the time I saw no alternative but to take that descending journey. At this point of whatever it is I'm attempting to do here, I didn't actually notice the underlying mistake I was about to perform, which is one of the hazards or self-presenting opportunities of pursuing creativity. So is it actually a mistake or a fortunate miscalculation? In the end, it was nothing more than a very mild speed hump. You could say that it was almost unnoticeable. You could also say that it was really not even worth mentioning, but it's all about the journey, right? Anyway, all it took to fix this abnormality was a carefully dimensioned piece of timber to solve the issue, and I moved on. I'd like to take a moment to raise a topic. It's a topic that has occupied a significant portion of my thoughts in recent decades. It's something I no longer take for granted. As a result of this reflection, I've developed a great appreciation for the significance and importance of creativity. Sometimes, when a vision forms in my mind's eye, something strange occurs when it comes to that vision being delivered to my hand as I start drawing. Something gets lost in translation when the idea transmitted from my brain moves down through my arms, then attempts to control my fingers as they clasp and guide the pencil, which in this case resulted in me deploying some very unfortunate and somewhat confronting doodling. But hey, it's all part of the creative process, right? Anyway, I believe I successfully rescued the situation. While editing this video, I unintentionally engaged in a retrospective, somewhat equivalent to a post-mortem, although in this case perhaps it's more like Dr. Frankenstein giving life to his monster. I'm not sure if what I've just observed is a display of insanity or an exercise in discovery. Either way, I enjoyed it. Okay, so that's it for this custom-made constraint, but it can't stay there because the build must go on.